Wonderful to see you all here. And today we'll talk about obviously a very interesting and difficult topic, is how do we construct a modern spirituality that is kind of based in what's real, what's a direct experience that we can have. And of course we're not looking to create a new religion, let's say, but it does also become very important to define. And there are a few areas that we can start looking at in order to get a sense of what is real, what makes sense, what becomes a part of some sort of bigger systematic whole. So we're going to raise a few of those questions today, and I definitely don't say that I have all the answers. I will make a few proposals, a few possibilities as to how we can look at this question. We will, of course, also raise quite a few questions about the whole topic, about what does it mean nowadays to have a coherent spirituality. So I'm going to start by laying out, first of all, where our dilemma lies as a society at this time. And our dilemma lies in the fact that we, as a society, as a culture, certainly in the West, have to a very large extent rejected the spirituality or the religions in which we grew up. So in the West, traditionally a Christian societies, certainly the old dogmatic approaches of Christianity have been rejected largely. There are, of course, still large portions of the population, certainly in the USA and in countries like Brazil, that are still very Christian. But let's say before the First World War, even up until the 60s, religion was an incredibly powerful and central force in holding a society together. That might be based on certain principles of repression or of sort of this monolithic approach to religion. But even so, it did create a sense of unity. It did create a sense of cohesion. So now we don't have that sense of, let's say, a spiritual cohesion. We do, of course, have New Age. A lot of people subscribe to the New Age beliefs, which are very loose. It's not a cohesive body of information. That, of course, doesn't make it less valid. It's just a different approach. And then, of course, there are a lot of people, for example, that practice yoga. Something like yoga is a very powerful spiritual force, and it certainly, is kind of an age-old system that has very powerful results. But I think if one really embraces yoga and Hinduism as a, let's say, spiritual system, it's going to be very difficult to see that as, let's say, a spirituality or as a religious path. So we've got people, people in the modern West who might sort of say, well, I come from Christianity, and even though I don't necessarily oppose that, it doesn't really talk to my soul. I meditate, and most meditation nowadays is kind of based in Buddhism in many ways. I kind of meditate, so there's a little bit of a Buddhist feel to what I do. And then I have certain other beliefs about where we are at this time, maybe in terms of going into some sort of great awakening. I practice yoga, but none of those kind of hold together as a coherent system or definition. Again, not that we necessarily need definition, but sometimes it is nice to have definition, because when we have definition, we can start to look, let's say, towards a future, or start to create and define certain ways that take us forward faster. So that is one of the dilemmas we face, is that our spiritual vision as a society certainly is very fractured. And of course, I think on the whole in the West, society is very fractured along ideological lines. even just in general world views, in terms of more scientific base perhaps, or a more spiritual base. And I think that is one of the other big splits in modern society, of course, is that split between the left brain and the right brain. The last 100 years has really kind of herded humanity into a very left brain approach, which is a very rational approach to life. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course we need the rational, of course we need the scientific. But that kind of corrals us into seeing the world in a very particular way. And the linear left brain approach is very much about 2 + 2 = 4. This is what science says, this is what natural laws say, and therefore this is how life is. In my belief is that yes, those physical laws absolutely exist. Certain physical laws exist. Let's say, for example, in healing very specifically, if you break an arm, you would go to a doctor and you would have that arm set. I mean, that's certain irrefutable physical laws. Putting the arm back together in a particular way is going to allow the healing of that arm. But then if we go into the right side of the brain, or the more spiritual approach, then we start going into a much broader perspective. For example, yes, those bones need to be set, but then let's say on a more spiritual level, we would say, how do we heal the physical or the cellular trauma around that? And we could even, go a whole lot broader and say, okay, what is the meaning of breaking that arm? Why was the arm broken? Was there a specific lesson that needed to come from that situation? And if that's the case, just setting the bones isn't going to make the problem go away. If this example is true, that there is a bigger picture to it, what do I need to do to heal the holistic aspect of this question that's come up? And again, this is just a very simple example, but it does kind of, for me, show up some of the dichotomies of this interface between science and spirituality. We actually need both. I'm certainly not saying that we need to exclude one for the other. But what has happened in the last 100 or so years, probably a little bit longer, probably the last 150 years, is that science has kind of taken the upper hand in our worldview, in how we understand the world, in how we look at ourselves. We need a spirituality that actually reflects, I would say, deeper universal principles, but also that reflects where we are in the world as a society at this time. And that, again, is one of the big dilemmas. One of the approaches we can take to spirituality is to be, eclectic, take the bits that we like and exclude the bits that we don't like. But of course, that can bring about superficiality. The other approach is to maybe try and go back to our roots somehow. How do we define our roots? Is it our cultural roots? Is it our racial roots? Is it historic roots? Or again, is it just going to something that attracts us because we resonate, our soul resonates with that energy? Even that principle of sort of so-called going back to our roots has certain problems because it's difficult to define what that means. And that again brings me back to, and this is of course a question I've been contemplating my whole spiritual life, is what is my spirituality in this time of change? And I guess what comes back to me more and more is it is a return to nature. It is a return to our own individual nature. Again, it goes back to that ancient Greek principle of know thyself. It's through knowing ourselves, through knowing the individual, that we can know the bigger picture. It's only through us taking this journey that we can really know ourselves. It's a process that takes years and decades. It's not something that happens quickly or after a few meditations or after a few very profound sessions of whatever sort. Of course, all of those contribute, but it's never a quick, easy answer. So one of the first unifying principles that we can look at is nature. How do I fit into nature? What is the nature around me? What does that nature around me mean to me? And what is the bigger picture? What does that nature mean? How is that connected to divinity in some way? So for me, that starts to make sense. And again, we're going to unpack this problem or this fascinating journey in different ways. But when we start to ask those questions about nature, of course, a whole lot of other things come into it. A whole lot of other issues come into it. Of course, the way that we see nature is related to ourselves as individuals. It's our individual experience of nature that gives us some sort of experience. It relates to our culture, our cultural approaches to nature. And the large monotheistic religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have largely seen us as humans separate from nature. Nature itself is not something that offers, let's say, spiritual solutions, or it's not a source of spiritual inspiration, let's say. In these monotheistic religions, it should come exclusively from God or some godlike figure. And that very often, usually, is based on dogma. It's based on the teachings of a prophet or a series of prophets. And those teachings happened more than 1,500 years ago. So it's kind of becomes a little bit more difficult to place that in the context of the modern world, those purely intellectual belief systems. So again, that takes us back to nature. What is the lesson of nature? If nature is a book, how do we read that book? And if nature is a language, how can we start to learn that language? And that starts to make this question of, I guess, what is a modern spirituality based in nature more accessible, because nature itself is kind of universal. Nature itself didn't just happen by coincidence. There's some sort of mind or consciousness that organized the forms of nature to look the way that they do. So nature is universal, but then at the same time, nature has its own message. It has its own aliveness. And like everything, that can be interpreted on different levels. It can be seen as very literal. It can be taken to, being very esoteric. It can bring in different spirits or different consciousnesses that are working with nature. So the power of that is, first of all, that nature is very direct. And nature, religion is very direct. It's something that we can see, we can touch, and we can have a spiritual experience through that. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which we can do that, some of the principles and practices that we can work with in this regard. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about belief, because belief is, of course, key in this whole question that we're looking at today. And that is, first of all, that many beliefs are handed down to us, and through our journey of self-discovery, we start to question some of those beliefs. Usually religion and the religious status quo is questioned on some level. So belief is something that's often handed down, and then a point comes where we start to choose our beliefs. But of course, choosing our beliefs is also fraught with some problems, because in order for belief to sort of really work, and belief is about creating reality. Belief itself is about creating magic, because it's what we believe that's actually going to determine how we see the world and what we create in the world. So then we start to need to create new beliefs. And we can't create new beliefs unless if we truly and profoundly believe them. So it's through the believing that the magic of belief can happen. But we can't just make up the beliefs. So what is that intermediary step, I guess, is the big question. And I think part of that is personal revelation, personal epiphany, personal experience of the divine on some level. And of course that happens in many ways. It can just be a vision that we have, it can be a dream that we can have, it can be profound breath work or shamanic sessions that change our life. It can be a near-death experience that changes our life. But at some point within our process of defining our beliefs, we need to fully detach from the old beliefs, not just say, I don't like that, I'm not going to believe that anymore, because very often we say that and we don't fully live and embody that. So a part of it is releasing old beliefs, and that of course is the process of sacrifice, making sacred, or purging, letting go of the old. And then the other side is having the revelation, the personal experience of the divine, so that within ourselves we have the absolute knowing that the divine exists, or that we had a particular experience that allowed us to have a particular insight that was profound enough for us to be able to change our beliefs. So that's on a personal level, of course. When it comes to, let's say, spirituality on a religious level, all religion, I think, is kind of a shared community experience. And some religions have been about converting others, and sort of this monolithic belief system, dogma that needs to be followed. So that's kind of the dark side of where religion has been. The light side, of course, is that religion is practiced in community, through community and the pooling of resources. Those communities can create the sacred spaces. Those communities can share celebrations that on the one hand support the individual, but that on the other hand also support the community itself. And that can therefore allow great expansion. And a very simple example of that is that certainly in the West, there are less and less community-based religious experiences in sacred spaces. Yes, there are lots of retreats and workshops around that do have very beautiful, profound teachings and healings. And of course, all of us have participated in those. But that experience is taken to a whole other level when we do it in a sacred temple that's in nature, perhaps, that involves many people bringing together their love on the one hand, their vision, but also working together to create a feast and a festival with colors and experiences and music that take us beyond ourselves, not only in terms of what we personally experience of the divine, but also in terms of kind of really feeling the collective on a very profound level. So that aspect of religion, which is community-based, is really important. And of course, I'm not only talking about, let's say, the festivals and the celebrations, also talking about the coming together of the mind, the consciousness of people who share those beliefs to bring about healing or to bring about positive change in the world on, sort of in terms of the bigger picture. But we sit in the dilemma in the West where we've rejected the old collective belief systems, and we're starting to grapple with, first of all, what are our individual belief systems? And then secondly is, how do we build bridges with other people who have similar belief systems? And then how do we grow within that, or even just grow that community? And that happens naturally, of course. But we lack the momentum, I think, in many regards, in that there aren't many people around us who think like us. Or there might be people who think like us, but there are even less people who actually practice and do the very tangible things that we can do in order to enhance our spirituality and enhance our belief. So, belief on the one hand is a choice, but belief on the other hand needs to have profound roots. Thirdly, belief also needs to have a sense of vision, a shared vision of where are we going. Many past religions have had the future vision of converting everyone to the same belief as them, which is obviously very simplistic. It's obviously very cozy and comfortable to know that everybody around you thinks the way that you do, and if one of those people questions and goes off the path a little bit, then they deserve to be ostracized by the community. That's kind of cozy, and it's a very uncomfortable comfort zone for some. I don't think the people here would ever want to approach religion like that. But that is also a tendency that we as humans have, is of orthodoxy, the tendency to try to create orthodoxy, the tendency to have the in-group of, we're right and therefore all the others are wrong. And that tendency as a result to demonize the other, the ones out there, the non-believers. And yeah, that in itself is a whole other topic. And I think one of the first things perhaps that we here as the smaller collective within the bigger collective have already learned on our personal journeys is that it's very difficult to say this is right, this is wrong. Something can be personally right for me, but it's very difficult to say this is universally right or wrong. Obviously there are very big universal laws, don't harm another, that love is a uniting force and we should all strive for love. But beyond some of those very universal ones, this shared perspective on reality becomes very difficult. And it becomes very difficult to be self-righteous, because as we question on our individual paths, we begin to realize that just as we hold a belief, someone else holds maybe an opposite belief, but they still carry that same belief. So again, this brings me back to nature. It's not that we need to become materialist at all. Given the fact that you have a tree that's 100 years old and holds a very powerful energy, isn't the be-all and end-all, but that tree, for example, already is holding something sacred, or a mountain is holding something sacred. We can see it for its beauty, but we can also experience it on an inner level. We can feel certain places have a better energy, or a more powerful energy, or a more inspiring energy. And that already starts to get us beyond, let's say, the dogma of this is right because I was told this or because I believe this. It's like when you stand in front of a beautiful mountain, you can say something is happening here. Not everybody would be able to feel that necessarily, but there's a very real force that we're standing in front of in the case of a mountain or a tree. So with nature, we can start to create a reverence and a relationship with tangible things, which of course in some way are containing the intangible. So we need to be able to really experience directly the power of something in order for us to truly believe it. And again, this can be through an epiphany. It can be through having an experience in a mountain or by a tree that can really touch the soul. And that doesn't mean that we have to go and live in that mountain and only be in the presence of that mountain and dedicate our lives to that mountain in order for the spirituality to stay alive. No, we as humans think symbolically, but these experiences can start to define how we experience our world and how we experience our spirituality. Nature becomes kind of a unifying force, I believe. And, if we start to talk about, okay, what could this nature spirituality or a future spirituality be? Certainly that is a meeting point with, let's say, other cultures, because that is another question that we have in terms of spirituality is, one culture approaches the same thing in a different way to another one, largely because of the handed down beliefs. But the handed down beliefs are already very powerful. They already hold so much energy. So just as a very simple example, I will use the sun as an illustration of this question. On the one hand, on a very universal level, the sun is the sun, and it is this force that creates light around which the world rotates, for example. So that's universally, accepted to be a force. Science would say it's one thing, it's kind of a star emanating light. That's what it does. On a spiritual level, we can start to say, okay, this is a body in the heavens that has a great gravity, that has a great light. And that means more than just the light itself. That light is healing in some way, or that light is life-giving, and therefore it has a more powerful purpose. That's on the universal level. Then on a cultural level, of course, different cultures call the sun different things. In Greek culture, that is the god Helios. In Japanese culture, that is the goddess Amaterasu. So for the Japanese, the sun god is a goddess, is a woman. So that's already got different characteristics. And therefore, that already shows how culturally this force is interpreted in a different way. And then the next level of this, of course, is we all need to have our personal experiences. So for one person, the sun would be a source of healing. Some people could say that they are fed by the sun, not only spiritually, but also physically. So that then becomes a personal experience with the sun. So those three levels, universal, cultural, and individual or personal, I think are ever present. And when it comes to starting to look at this question of, what is nature religion, we can all agree that the sun is the sun. The sun is this body of light. We might disagree as to what that's called and to what some of the specific qualities are. We might disagree as to exactly what that sun does for us personally as individuals. But at the end of the day, the sun is still the sun. And that is what I find very beautiful about, ancient religions. Certainly the Greeks, Romans, Hindus understood this, is that I call the sun one name, you call the sun another name, but I can still go and worship in front of the sun, or I can still go to the temple of the sun. I can worship that God by my name in a temple that's got another name, but it's still essentially the same energy that we're working with. And that, I think, also starts to unpack this problem of, let's say, diversity of understanding or diversity of perspective as to how we experience the world. Of course, that diversity doesn't only come in terms of culture, it comes in terms of personal experience. So in that sense, a nature spirituality, given where we stand in the world situation, is a way to return to certain commonalities, certain tangibles, which are at the same time intangible. We understand that. But where we can start to even define some sort of pantheon around which we can construct our beliefs. And I think one of the fundamentals of this, of course, is the 5 elements. And the 5 elements are, on a symbolic level, observed throughout the world. There's this principle of earth, which is everything that is solid. It's the bones. The principle of water, water has particular qualities, and those qualities can correspond to certain inner processes like the emotions. There's the element of air, which is the wind, which moves, which is our thoughts, and the element of fire, which burns, which is passion, which is the sun, which is the light, which holds certain qualities. So there we can start to see the elements, the four elements, certainly of physicality. The fifth element then, of course, is the soul element. It's that energy that brings order to the four elements. And even though those elements are maybe interpreted slightly differently between different groups or different cultures, those are some of the very basic building blocks that we can also start to work with. And, you know, when I say work with, that starts to inform our spiritual practices. That starts to allow us to construct, let's say, certain spiritual practices that have meaning, that are coherent within a bigger picture. So just to recap some of those practices, for example, and these are practices that we see, I think, in all religions, the purification or the attuning to the element of earth relates to fasting. It relates to kind of mortifying the body in some way so that the hold of the physical body, the hungers of the physical body, are no longer at the forefront, so that we can open space for something else. Obviously, there are more practices than just fasting for the physical. The element of water, of course, relates to bathing, baptism, having a sacred experience with that water representing the washing clean of the slate. Of course, that comes from observation of life. If we roll around in mud and we wash ourselves with water, we're going to be clean on a very literal level. But then we can extrapolate and take that to a spiritual level. And that water, especially if that water is coming from, let's say, a sacred waterfall or fountain, that has even more meaning. And that, of course, is where this principle of belief comes in, or this building block of belief comes in. If you absolutely believe that a particular fountain is sacred, or holy water in the church is sacred, and you are washed or baptized in that, and you believe not only the water is doing it, but the act that you are submitting yourself to that purification, if you believe that's significant, it will be significant in your lives. But in the case of the elements, if you don't believe the elements are going to do anything, their impact is going to be a whole lot less. So again, we've got this, it's not a dichotomy, but it's almost like a virtuous circle. It could be a vicious circle, but this virtuous circle of the more belief you give something, the more you practice it, the more powerful it becomes, which then reinforces the belief, which then makes it more powerful the next time you practice it. So it becomes this virtuous circle where you're actually building your belief. And building belief has to be done in tangible ways. And again, the elements are one of the ways of doing this, because the elements are real. Water does have an actual impact. Spending time with water does have an actual effect. So we just need to submit ourselves to those practices in order to also gain more of the information, the insights, the downloads that interaction brings. The element of air is purification of the mind, but as we know, it's also breath work. I think most people here have practiced breath work. Breath work can work on different levels. It can clear the mind, but it can also clear the body, can clear the intelligence that is in the body, so that we can also be reset. And breathwork works whether you believe in it or not. It's the element of air that you are choosing to interact with. You're choosing that to become an alchemy. And again, of course, if you absolutely believe in breathwork and you practice it, that's going to make your inner experience a whole lot more powerful. But breathwork's still going to work whether you believe in it or not. And that is the power of the actual element. And then the same goes for the element of fire, which can either be sitting in front of fire, it can be the process of alchemizing a mineral, observing how a mineral changes state from an ore into a pure metal, for example. That process of transmutation is also something that's irrefutable. Fire is the agent that makes that possible. If fire can do that to a metal, surely it can do it to the soul as well. So those are correspondences that inform one another, and that we can actually then practice, and that we can actually then cultivate in our lives. The fifth element, of course, is a little bit more intangible. It's more abstract. That is the element of soul, the element of spirit. That is, I think, an experience we can only have if our belief is open enough to having that experience. If we have an epiphany and we heed that epiphany, if we follow guidance that we're given in some way, if we are willing to change the habits which represent the world of habit, the world of the four elements, if we're willing to make changes there and allow in the higher vision of the fifth element, then we can start to transform and transmute those four elements, which normally would be very set in their interaction. But when we bring in the fifth element, we are starting to allow transformation. And of course, transformation is essential to any spirituality. I think most religions lay out the mechanisms of transformation, or promise transformation if a certain creed is accepted. And some creeds are quite simplistic in saying all you need to do is believe, and then believe in this figure, and then everything will be okay. I believe the theory of that, but hypocrisy comes in when people don't fully embrace that space of being reborn or saved or redeemed in some way. But I think most religions over the years have observed the process of transformation. And that, of course, goes back to the seasons. The seasons are related to the four elements, the four seasons. The seeming death of winter, allowing the rebirth into spring. The flourishing of new life in summer. The harvesting of fruits in autumn. And then the return to the dearth of winter, where that outward journey takes us inward, makes us introspective, where the looking inwards plants new seeds, and then it allows that rebirth to take place. And of course, that process of rebirth in itself is the fifth element, because it's emerging out of seeming death into new life. And of course, that can be the new life of a plant in spring after a cold winter. That can also be the new life that is cultivated within us through whatever journey we go on of symbolic death, so that we can be spiritually reborn. That is, again, the fifth element. We're acknowledging the end of an old container, and we're opening the way to expand into a new container. Obviously, that becomes more esoteric, but I think that rebirth element is the basis of religions that promise, being saved, being redeemed, being liberated. And it could be as simple as being, saved from your own sins, or it could be as great as being awakened out of a state of slumber into a state of full awakening. So that rebirth aspect is, of course, the basis of all mystery schools, ancient mystery schools, modern mystery schools. It's the basis of deep process work in ourselves, be that psychological or spiritual. It's where we transcend the ego, die to the ego, the old ego patterns, and have some sort of revelation or epiphany that show us the new bounds of our container. We're no longer stuck in the old container, but this new container has certain new definitions. So that theme of the 5 elements, that theme of ego, death, spiritual rebirth, is already a very powerful basis for a spirituality that's maybe a little bit more esoteric, but we do actually see that in nature with the seasons. We see that in the cycles of plants, in the cycles of our own lives. So in that way, we kind of start to realize we're connecting to truth. Of course, it becomes difficult when we try and turn that into a dogma. But there are certain rules that we can follow. There are certain guidelines as well that we can follow in this process of rebirth. So there we're already taking a few steps towards what is a spirituality nowadays. The elements are one, of course. Then we've got the cosmos looking around us. We've got Mother Earth. Mother Earth and the physical mother, or our own mother, or mothers as an archetype, are related. A child emerges from the mother. We as children of the earth depend on the earth for our survival. That's a very powerful archetype. That's an irrefutable archetype. We all needed a mother of some sort. Our relationship to our mother is a different story, and that of course gives rise to mythology. All the different stories about all the different types of mothers. Could be the dread mother that Kali in Hinduism can be. It could be the initiating mother that Demeter in Greek religion could be. So there's different facets to the mother. But the archetype remains the same. That is still the womb from which we have sprung. The father is a little bit more abstract, a little bit more difficult perhaps to define, but related to the father, there's the authority figure, the king. It doesn't need to be a male king, but it's that energy of leadership. It's that energy of the hero, of defining, let's say, a path, or having a vision and finding the ways to put that into the world. This, of course, is a whole, that father or leader archetype is a little bit more abstract, but the ancient religions and belief systems kind of saw that as the sky. Earth Mother is tangible, what we have here. The Father is the sky. The Father feeds us, or the sky feeds us with lightning, thunder, rain, and the rains, the sun that come out of the heavens are what makes it possible for the earth to flourish, just as the seed of the man needs to impregnate the woman in order for that life to spring forth. So those archetypes, they take perhaps a little bit of interpretation. They're about finding correspondences between the natural world and ourselves and our own experience. And of course, there's many different ways of interpreting that. And of course, there's different cultural approaches to that. But that is the beginning of the journey of bringing meaning into our lives, bringing meaning into our experience. And of course, where there is meaning, there is some sort of spirituality or some sort of religion. Some of the other, I think, very tangible and real things that we can look at is in the cosmos, call it astronomy or astrology. Of course, they're basically the same thing. Astronomy denies that the heavenly bodies have an effect on us. Astrology believes that those heavenly bodies do, or those planets do. I think the 7 visible planets are also a very good starting point for us to construct some sort of pantheon. And those, of course, are the moon. And in many cultures, the moon relates to our instincts, our deeper feelings. The moon is changeable, just as our emotions are changeable. The moon affects the tides, so it has a tangible effect on us, on our waters. The moon has an effect on the tides of the ocean, but also on our inner waters, menstruation. There's a force that's interacting with us. And the sun and the moon are are very obvious, and they're very present. Of course, as we then go to Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, that changes. But within astrology, each one of those planets and the corresponding gods and goddesses have a meaning. Perhaps those are the most basic archetypes, the 7 classical planets, of what it means to be human, of what certain temperaments are perhaps, or certain ways of relating to the divine are. And again, just a very important point that I need to make is that just as nature is tangible, just as the sun is the sun, each one of us will have a different relationship with that. There might be broad outlines of what that sun means, but this goes back to the 80-20 rule. It's like kind of 80% of what the sun is what the sun is. But kind of 20% of that is our own personal experience of the sun. Did we grow up in a country where there's not very much sun and therefore we yearn for the sun? Or did we grow up in the desert where there's way too much sun and we crave the opposite, or we crave shade, or we crave water? So that changes our emotional relationship to that. The planets then become a little bit more abstract, but over the centuries and in all cultures, a connection between the planets and the human experience has been made. And then, of course, that's a little bit more abstract. That's out there. That's the heavens above. Within nature, we of course have the trees and the plants, which are either foods or medicines or poisons. And different cultures perhaps see the spirits of those plants in different ways. They might personify them or personalize them. And that in itself might give rise to a pantheon. But again, on a spiritual level, when we ingest a certain plant and it has a certain effect on us, that is kind of the divine coming in and giving us an experience that is tangible. And the experience might be different for different people, but it's something that's tangible, and it's a force that we can start to give meaning to. And of course, this is the realm of shamanism. Ancient shamans, modern shamans have been about interacting with nature, understanding nature, in order for the forces of nature to heal individuals and to heal communities. So very often the shaman in traditional cultures has been the intermediary to negotiate between the natural world and the human world. And of course, just symbolically speaking, in history, when we as humans were living in forests or by the sea, close to the land, the forces of nature affected us much more directly. And I do believe that the reason why in the modern world we are faced with these spiritual dilemmas is that we are so urbanized and our environments are so controlled, and even the information that we have access to, even though we have the internet, is still so controlled. And even when it's not controlled, it's so filtered by our belief systems that we are living in a much poorer environment. And over the years, cities were a solution to certain problems that existed, like avoiding famine, for example, organizing a society. And there are, of course, ways in which cities can work beautifully and perfectly. But cities can also become an urban hell and an absolute disconnect from the divine. And that is where we sit, where we have to redefine how we live in cities. And in speaking about this nature spirituality, it doesn't mean that we have to go and live on the land again, in my belief. We can keep creating a relationship with nature in our gardens, on our balconies, on our verandas, by the rivers, in the parks that we live close to. And going back to that original principle of where shamanism comes from. Shamanism comes from humans interacting with nature on the one hand, but also the forces beyond nature, that are represented in nature, to grow within ourselves, but also to connect to the cosmos in some way. So we can develop these, and some of the ways of developing these relationships, of course, is through our reverence, and our reverence is expressed through our offerings. The offering needn't be a thing that we offer to nature, even though that's a nice gesture. It could also be the time that we give, the space that we give ourselves to reconnect to the earth and to nature. But I think the physical tangibility of making a physical offering also has a power, and it's not just the power of, I give you this, I make this offering of wine to the gods, and therefore I ask that the gods give me something back. It's not a bribe. It's actually a sensitivity that we're developing, and a generosity and a willingness to interact that we're developing through offerings. And offerings have existed in all religions, in all cultures, except in some of the more modern revisionist religions, where that's kind of been eliminated. But that principle of offering, of revering, devoting, humbling ourselves to these forces of nature, is in itself very connecting and liberating. Another way in which we can create relationships with natural forces is through pilgrimage and through visiting sacred sites. That could be mountains, or it could be, doing the pilgrimages like the Camino in Spain, or pilgrimages in Japan or in India, where there's a sacred site and where hundreds of thousands or millions of people feed that sacred site, not only with their offerings, with their intentions, but also with their belief. So that creates an entity, or it enhances an existing spiritual entity to become more and more of a god, or to become more and more tangible in the experience of people. I mean, that's, it's a little bit like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Was the site that powerful before that it inspired the belief, or was it the belief that created the profound experience? And of course it is a little bit of both. And then another aspect of our practices, I believe, is creating beauty, is physically creating sacred space within our home, be that an altar, be that a sacred garden, meditating within a pyramid, whatever that might be. But it's finding a space within our living space that we cultivate as something sacred, as something more than just the nuts and bolts of what's in front of us. It's creating a synergy between the physical, which is what we make, and the spiritual, which is bringing in our beliefs, so that we create this sacred space. And whenever we charge a sacred space and spend time in a sacred space, we receive more and we also give more. It's always reciprocal. When we give, we always receive. And when we receive in that way, in a spiritual context, it plants seeds. It opens our mind to new ways. It expands our consciousness so that we can have a deeper experience next time, on a very nuts and bolts level, but so that we can also grow, and that as our ability to see grows, as our vision grows, we start to perceive more of what we can do, or of what God, Goddess is in our lives, and how further we can grow within that, or heal within that, and where that can take us. So this is obviously a very big topic. As I said before, it's something I think about a lot, because on the one hand, I know this is something that we need in our modern world. We need, let's say, a coherent and a convincing spirituality, not a mishmash of different ideas that we just kind of put together that don't inspire a vision or that don't have a form, be that a loose form that allows us to strengthen our belief or strengthen our devotion. So I think this is a question that we should all be focusing on in some way in our spiritual growth. It's, why am I doing this? Where is this taking me? What can I do to enhance my spiritual experience within this? So it's important for us to look at this, I think, in some way, and to the extent that it helps us create better, stronger, more meaningful community. And I know we are doing that, and I know it unfolds step by step, and it unfolds through stages of revelation, collectively and individually. But I think it is a strength that we as a community need to develop together, ask the questions together, find the solutions together. So thank you everyone for sharing today, for being here. Thank you very much. Have a great day or evening further. Bye-bye.